I slammed the truck door so hard the windows rattled, my boots hitting gravel as I stared at what used to be my pride and joy. Where 8 massive rainwater collection tanks once stood along my barn's north wall, there was nothing but concrete pads and fresh tire tracks in the mud. 40,000 gallons of carefully harvested rainwater gone. The elaborate gutter system I'd spent 2 years installing hung useless, dripping into empty air. Standing in my driveway with a clipboard and that familiar smirk was Patricia "Patty" Henriksen, HOA president of Meadowbrook Estates, wearing her signature pink blazer and those oversized sunglasses that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. Behind her stood 2 men in coveralls next to a commercial water truck. Engines still running. "You're not supposed to be back until Thursday," she said, not even attempting to hide her satisfaction. "This is HOA business. You're interfering with a community improvement project." "Community improvement?" I gestured toward the empty concrete pads. "Those were my rainwater tanks. Patty. 40,000 gallons I collected legally on my own property." She consulted her clipboard with theatrical precision. According to HOA Regulation 847(c), passed last Tuesday, oversized water storage creates mosquito breeding grounds and poses a public health hazard. The tanks have been relocated for community safety. Relocated where? Her smile could have cut glass. "That information is restricted to board members. You'll receive a formal notice within 7 business days." She pulled out her phone. "Now I'm calling 911 because you're threatening HOA personnel." I hadn't moved, hadn't raised my voice, but Patty was already dialing, and I could hear sirens in the distance growing closer. "My name is Marcus Thompson, and I'm 52 years old. After 25 years as a petroleum engineer and a bitter divorce that cost me everything, I'd bought 5 acres outside Meadowbrook, Texas, specifically to escape HOA nonsense. The property was older than the subdivision, clearly outside their jurisdiction, with a 1970s ranch house and enough space for the sustainable living project I'd always dreamed of. The rainwater collection system represented 2 years of weekends and $15 of my own money. Texas has some of the strongest rainwater harvesting rights in the country. What falls on your property belongs to you. Period. I'd researched everything meticulously, pulled proper permits with the county, even hired a structural engineer to ensure the tank placement wouldn't affect drainage. The system was beautiful in its simplicity. 0-gallon tanks connected to a filtration setup that could provide clean drinking water for months. Solar pumps moved water through the house for everything except the kitchen sink, which stayed on city water to avoid health department hassles. During the drought 3 years ago, while my neighbors were paying surge pricing for trucked-in water, I'd been completely self-sufficient. Patty had first shown up 6 months after I'd moved in, clipboard in hand, even then, explaining that while my property wasn't technically in the HOA, I was in an adjacent cooperation zone and should consider joining for everyone's benefit. I'd politely declined. The visits became monthly, then weekly, always with some new angle about community standards or property values. The breaking point came when she started taking pictures of my rainwater tanks from the road, claiming they were an eyesore visible from the Meadowbrook Community Center. Never mind that my property sat 300 yards away behind a tree line, or that the tanks were painted earth-tone brown to blend with the landscape. These industrial-looking structures don't match community aesthetics. She'd complained during her last visit. Meadowbrook maintains certain standards. I'd pointed out that my property predated their development by 40 years and wasn't subject to their rules. She'd left without another word, but the look in her eyes should have warned me. The harassment started small, as it always does with people like Patty. A county inspector showed up claiming someone had reported unpermitted construction. He took one look at my permit documentation and building plans, shook his head, and muttered something about busybody neighbors wasting taxpayer money. Then came the certified letters, official-looking documents with the Meadowbrook HOA letterhead demanding I attend compliance hearings for violations I'd supposedly committed: failure to maintain adequate screening of industrial equipment, improper drainage modification affecting adjacent properties, non-conforming structure, placement in violation of Community Covenant 23B. I threw them in the trash. My property wasn't subject to their covenants, and any lawyer could confirm that in 5 minutes, the letters escalated to final notices with threats of legal action and fines. When I continued ignoring them, Patty showed up with her husband Dale, a soft-spoken man who looked perpetually embarrassed by his wife's behavior. "Marcus, let's be reasonable," she'd said, standing at my front gate. "These tanks are a liability issue. What if a child drowns? What if they leak and contaminate groundwater? The HOA is prepared to offer you fair compensation to remove them voluntarily." "How much?" I'd asked, mostly out of curiosity. $2,000 for the entire system. I'd laughed. The tanks alone had cost $8. "Ling? Patty, those tanks aren't going anywhere. They're legal, permitted, and on my property. Your HOA has zero authority here." That's when she'd played her trump card. "The county is reviewing whether your property should be annexed into Meadowbrook for tax assessment purposes. Consolidated services. You understand? Once that happens, you'll be subject to our full covenant package." "Good luck with that," I'd said, but a cold knot had formed in my stomach. The next week, my property taxes were reassessed upward by 40%. The week after that, I received a notice that my private well might need to be abandoned due to groundwater protection protocols being implemented in the area. Each notice mentioned coordination with local community stakeholders and homeowner associations. Patty was using her husband's connections. Dale worked for the county planning department to wage bureaucratic warfare against me. She couldn't force me to join the HOA, but she could make my life miserable until I caved. The final straw came when I returned from a 3-day business trip to Houston to find a citation taped to my door. Apparently, someone had filed a complaint about stagnant water creating mosquito breeding conditions. The citation was signed by Dale Henriksen, Environmental Health Inspector, County Planning Department. I'd checked my tanks immediately. The water was crystal clear, constantly circulating through the filtration system, with screened inlets that prevented any insects from entering. Someone had filed a false report, and Dale had rubber-stamped it without even visiting the property. That night, I'd called my attorney. Susan Walsh had been my divorce lawyer and was exactly the kind of person you want in your corner when bureaucrats start playing dirty. Sharp, methodical, and absolutely ruthless when defending her client's property rights. They're trying to force annexation through harassment. She'd confirmed after reviewing the citations and tax reassessment, it's not legal, but it's effective if you don't fight back. The question is whether you want to fight or just pay them to go away. I'm not paying anyone anything. I'd said, "Those tanks stay." Good. Because I've been waiting for a case like this. Susan had smiled, the way sharks smile. Texas property law is very clear on rainwater harvesting rights. If they're claiming your legal system violates their covenants, they're essentially claiming jurisdiction over property they don't control. That's a civil rights violation under federal law. She'd started by requesting all documentation related to my property reassessment and the health citations. When the county dragged their feet, she'd filed a formal public information request. When they claimed the documents were exempt, she'd threatened a federal lawsuit. The documents, when they finally arrived, were fascinating. Every single complaint against my property had been filed by the same person, Patricia Henriksen. Using 3 different addresses within Meadowbrook Estates, the health inspection that resulted in the mosquito citation had been requested specifically by Dale Henriksen, who'd then conducted the inspection himself without disclosure of the conflict of interest. Most damning was an email chain between Patty and the county tax assessor discussing strategies for encouraging compliance with community standards in transitional areas. The assessor had suggested that higher tax burdens might motivate voluntary HOA participation by outlying property owners. Susan had forwarded everything to the Texas Attorney General's office with a complaint alleging civil rights violations and government corruption. She'd also filed an injunction against any further county action on my property pending resolution of the complaint. They made a mistake going after your water rights, she'd explained. Texas takes that very seriously. And using government positions to harass private citizens, that's a federal crime. I'd felt confident when I'd left for my business trip to Colorado. My legal position was solid. My property rights were clear. And Patty's harassment was fully documented. I hadn't expected her to steal my water tanks while I was gone. The deputies arrived just as Patty finished her 911 call, claiming I was threatening community workers and interfering with authorized HOA enforcement. I'd kept my hands visible and my voice calm, but I could see them trying to figure out why this woman was calling them about water tanks. "Sir, do you live here?" the taller deputy asked. Glancing between me and Patty, "Yes." "This is my property. Marcus Thompson." I handed him my driver's license and the property deed I kept in my truck's glove box. "Those men just stole 40,000 gallons of rainwater and 8 storage tanks from my property." "Stole?" Patty interjected. "These tanks were removed for public safety reasons under HOA authority." "Ma'am?" The deputy interrupted. "This property shows as being outside HOA jurisdiction. You got paperwork saying otherwise?" Patty's confidence flickered for just a moment. The tanks were a health hazard. The HOA board voted. The HOA board has no authority on non-member property, I said, pulling out my phone, and I have documentation proving these tanks were legally installed with county permits. The deputy examined my permit documents, then looked at the concrete pads where the tanks had been. "Sir, these permits appear valid." "Ma'am, you got a court order authorizing removal of someone else's property?" "I don't need a court order," Patty snapped. OA Regulation 847(c) clearly states, "Ma'am, HOA regulations don't apply to non-member properties." That's basic law. The deputy was losing patience. "Mr. Thompson, you want to file a theft report?" "Absolutely." That's when Patty made her fatal mistake. Instead of backing down, she doubled down. "Officer, you don't understand the situation. This man has been violating community standards for months. These tanks were breeding mosquitoes and contaminating groundwater. Dale Henriksen from the county health department specifically authorized their removal." "Dale Henriksen?" The deputy's eyebrows went up. "The planning department guy? He's not a health inspector." "He what? Yes?" "He is. He signed the citation." "Ma'am, Dale Henriksen works in planning and zoning. He has no authority over health violations." The deputy keyed his radio. "Dispatch. Can you get me a supervisor out here? We might have an impersonation issue." I watched Patty's face go white as she realized what she'd just admitted. Dale had been signing official health department documents without authority. That wasn't just harassment, it was fraud. The water truck drivers were looking nervous now, clearly understanding they'd just participated in theft of private property. The supervisor, who arrived 20 minutes later, was Detective Ray Castellanos, whom I recognized from Susan's preparation. He'd been investigating other complaints about the Henriksens. "Mr. Thompson, Detective Castellanos said after reviewing the situation, "Where exactly did these tanks go?" One of the truck drivers, sweating now, pointed toward Meadowbrook Estates. "They're at the community center. We were told it was a repossession." "By who?" "Mrs. Henriksen. She had official papers." Detective Castellanos looked at Patty. "Ma'am, I need to see those papers." Patty fumbled with her clipboard. Producing a single sheet of letterhead, Detective Castellanos examined it, then showed it to me. It was a forged county health department order, complete with an official-looking seal and Dale's signature as Environmental Health Inspector. Mrs. Henriksen. This document appears to be fraudulent. Dale Henriksen has no authority to issue health department orders, and this seal doesn't match county records. "That's impossible," Patty stammered. Dale said, "Ma'am, you're under arrest for theft of private property and possession of fraudulent government documents." As the handcuffs clicked around Patty's wrists, she looked at me with pure hatred. "This isn't over. Marcus, the HOA will fight this. You can't just ignore community standards forever." "Ma'am," Detective Castellanos said as he guided her toward his patrol car, "you might want to focus on getting a good lawyer instead of community standards right now." The aftermath unfolded exactly as Susan had predicted. Dale Henriksen was arrested at the county office 2 hours later, charged with fraud, abuse of office, and civil rights violations. The FBI got involved when it turned out the Henriksens had been running similar schemes against 3 other property owners. Using Dale's position to harass people into HOA compliance, my tanks were returned that same afternoon. Along with every drop of water that could be recovered, the HOA's insurance company cut me a check for $8,000 to cover restoration costs and damages, and another $25,000 to avoid a federal lawsuit. But the real satisfaction came 2 weeks later at the packed Meadowbrook Community Center meeting, where residents voted to dissolve the HOA entirely and remove Patty from any position of authority. Turns out, she'd been embezzling HOA funds to pay for her harassment campaigns, including the forged documents and unauthorized tank removal. The community voted to convert the HOA into a voluntary neighborhood association with no enforcement powers. Property values actually increased once word got out that the area was free from HOA tyranny. Patty and Dale both served 18 months in federal prison for civil rights violations and fraud. Their house went into foreclosure, and they moved to Oklahoma after their release. The community center now has a small plaque recognizing property owners' rights to rainwater harvesting and sustainable living. My tanks still stand along the barn wall, fuller than ever. During last summer's drought, I was able to share water with 3 neighbors whose wells ran dry. That's what community cooperation actually looks like: neighbors helping neighbors, not bureaucrats with clipboards forcing compliance through fraud and harassment. Sometimes the system works exactly as it should. Sometimes justice flows as freely as rainwater off a metal roof, filling the tanks that sustain us through the dry seasons ahead.